I'm standing at the foot of Tón Aill Taribh, the cliff of the rump of the bull, to bring a poem that I wrote exactly 10 years ago, to the hour, to the minute, and I've called the poem Todd Beamer, Thomas Burnett and Jeremy Glick in memoriam. Just to explain about the poem, at the time the poem was written 10 years ago, at the very moment the poem began to form in my head, I was teaching a class of Swedish university students in a town north of Stockholm. Crazily as it might seem, I was teaching a class about violence, about how people learn to be violent, when a colleague burst into the room and told us to turn on the television, that something awful was happening in New York. So we turned on the television and watched the events of September the 11th unfold. And at that moment I began to compose a poem which I'm going to relate in a moment. But first of all, I just want to explain some of the references in the poem. I began the poem that afternoon, worked on it that night, and completed it the following morning. I've never recited the poem in public before, and I'm doing so now at the foot of Tón Aill Taribh, because if you travelled 2,800 nautical miles in the direction the camera is pointing, or 3,200 imperial miles, or 3,500 kilometres approximately, as the crow flies, you would land in Stony Creek, which is the place of impact of Flight 93. And the poem is dedicated to some of the people on that flight, because as I read on the internet that night, all that night, about all the details I could gather, the amazing story of Flight 93 began to unfold. But in the poem, because of my own background and because of what I actually teach, I just want to explain a few of the references in the poem. I refer to my father, who died at the age of 93 years ago, and he was a military man, a legal officer, who was the Irish representative to the Geneva Conventions on War. And as you could imagine, he and I, all through my life, had many arguments about war and violence and terrorism in the north of Ireland and all these things. And then in regard to terrorism in the north of Ireland, I refer to a concept known as the ballot box and Armalite, which is the policy adopted by the IRA of having a political party as well as conducting their campaign of violence from the 1970s and onward, all through my adult life. I refer in the poem to the Shankill Butchers, which was a gang of Protestant terrorists, if you like, who chased and cut down and assaulted Catholics that they found in that area of Belfast. I refer to the Omagh bomb, which exploded in Omagh in 1998, just as the peace process in Northern Ireland was being signed, or after it was signed. The greatest casualty list that ever occurred in the terrible violence in the north of Ireland was the Omagh bomb. I refer also to casus belli, which is the whole legal, moral argument for war and for doing of retributive violence. I refer to De Valera, who was a famous Irish politician, President of Ireland, but who also happened to be President of Ireland when my father got his military commission, and on the wall of my father's home his commission from the President was prominent. I refer to my father, when he retired, had in his possession a parabellum pistol, which he determined had no license for, so he determined to throw it into the sea behind me here when we were sailing one time. But I hid the gun from him, and he forgot about it, so the gun passed into my possession. I refer to the Provos, that is the Provisional IRA, which were and are one of the most violent terrorist groups, Republican groups, freedom fighters, whatever you want to call them, in the world. And I also refer to, because all Irish families have been touched by Irish history, to another member of my family, contemporary of my father's, Tomás McYulla, an uncle of his, who happened to be a member of the IRA, not the Provisional IRA, but of the official IRA, and later president of Sinn Féin. I refer also to, obviously towards the end of the poem, the whole point of the poem, which are some of the heroes of Flight 93.